Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Glad you could join me. I don't know about you, but I think we're due for a little chat. So let's not waste another second. It's talk time. Crash Bandicoot was my franchise of choice back when I was a kid. The original PlayStation was actually the second home console in my household, but it was the first I really remember since my NES broke when I was no more than 4. Alongside the PS1, my sister and I were both allowed to pick up a game for it. Her choice was Metal Gear Solid, while mine was a copy of Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back. Technically neither was the first entry in their respective series, but it was clear from Crash's title that I was missing some context to appreciate what the game was about. I didn't care about starting from the beginning though. There was kind of a trend I'd keep up for years to come with games on Sony consoles, but let's not drift off track. When I was little, I'd be limited to 1 hour of gameplay a day, and Crash Bandicoot 2 would claim every last minute of it. I was never a big fan of that restriction, but what made it awful was the fact I didn't have a memory card to save my progress. I wasn't particularly good at the game back then, so 60 minutes generally meant I could clear the first warp room and scout out the second. Eventually I reached a level of competency where I could defeat the Komodo Bros and take a longing look at the third warp room before I was out of time. Since those days, Crash has become a series I've held close to the heart, and I've owned every title leading up to the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy. There's been a handful of respectable entries over the years, but it's difficult to deny that the franchise was at its height when Naughty Dog was at the helm. Among the platforming trilogy they developed, though, which game could be considered the best? I'm sure you'd presume, based on what I've said so far, that I'd claim Crash Bandicoot 2 as the franchise's finest. It'd be a fair presumption, considering it was the first one I played, and it'd also be right. But I don't consider it the top title strictly on the grounds of nostalgia, so hear me out. Crash games were defined by their approach to polygonal gameplay, boasting linear, 3D environments that could be described as a 2D platformer with more depth. The first installment did a commendable job setting this foundation, but by Crash Bandicoot Warped, the series shifted a little from what made it great and dabbled with different concepts. It's tough to fault the developers for that though. The natural evolution of a game engine encourages experimentation, since a lot of the code base could be carried over instead of being rewritten from scratch. Some of what they added in Warped offered up some worthwhile variety, but not all the new concepts were winners. Although your mileage may vary, I felt like more traditional stages would have made for a greater experience, even if it'd lead to some calling it more of the same or just uninspired. The only thing that really felt uninspired about Warped to me was its atmosphere. While the first entry explored the Wumpa Islands and the second expanded to other regions befitting its world, the third went with a cookie-cutter collection of time periods for its backdrops. Medieval, prehistoric, Egyptian, they all look like what you'd expect and kinda clash with the titular character and core cast. It was the first game in the series to feature Crash's sister Coco as a playable character though. Initially she could only be used in select levels, but her role was expanded in the Insane trilogy, permitting players to use her without restriction across all 3 games. Warped was also the first game in the series to feature time trials, which always goes a long way for replayability. And thankfully the remake introduced them into its predecessors too. The first game had the least going for it, but anyone would suspect that of the Bandicoot's beginnings, especially in a time where 3D gameplay was still very much in its infancy. A lot of fans deemed it the worst of the original trilogy, and while I don't disagree, the fact it was the last game I tried among the 3 certainly didn't help. I went into it with tempered expectations and came out loving it though. The unsettling atmosphere, courtesy of the soundtrack and lighting, made for a memorable adventure, but my appreciation for those elements came later in life. Back in my youth, a lot of the jams felt boring compared to the sequels. What I liked about the first game at that time was just how it was more Crash Bandicoot platforming to play. Like anyone who played the first game, jumping down the road to nowhere proved to be an ordeal, and I wasted a lot of lives on slippery climb. But fortunately I had a memory card by that time, so I was able to take advantage of the cruel save system every couple stages. From a gameplay perspective, Crash Bandicoot was pretty bare bones with jumping and spinning being the only core mechanics, but the second game hit its stride with the introduction of body slamming, sliding, and crawling. Naughty Dog really refined what the original offered with their second outing too. Cruising through the tundra on Polar, for example, was a less congested and fickle experience than the hog rides of its predecessor. The developers also took their experimentation with the formula further and brought in some interesting gimmicks, but they didn't dive off the deep end. Crash Bandicoot 2 also took a step in the right direction with its save system, allowing players to save after every stage should they so choose. The inclusion of warp rooms was quite welcome too. Instead of traversing an overworld map like in the first game, you'd roam around a circular space with portals leading to each level. It was a diegetic approach that made the world feel more cohesive and connected. Although Crash Warped improved the warp rooms by providing a central hub, its design felt a little overindulgent when it came to mechanics, introducing extensions of what came before following successful boss battles. These additions gave the game a sense of progression and mechanical variety absent in its predecessors, but there's something to be said for having all the tools from the onset, since difficulty can stem strictly from mastery and wouldn't be influenced by what may or may not be in the player's move pool. There wasn't much in the way of plot in the first Crash Bandicoot, offering up a cutscene at the beginning and the end to tie everything together, but it didn't need anything too complicated to convince players to explore the Wumpa Islands. The fact they took the damsel in distress trope was disappointing, but fortunately they left that direction in the dust with subsequent entries. The second game had a much stronger story. The developers swapped out Crash's girlfriend for his sister Coco, and had the eponymous Bandicoot tasked with aiding his former enemy Cortex to collect crystals, clueless that he's being used for nefarious ends. Cortex, Brio, and Coco would contact Crash at different points in the adventure through a hologram projector in the warp rooms, which led to each cleared stage being accompanied by anticipation for a conversation. The third game carried on this tradition and gave each boss time to talk during transitions in their respective warp rooms, but these interactions lost a bit of the second game's charm when it came to presentation. While you can still claim they're diegetic since Crash is listening to them while traveling through portals, it doesn't carry the same spatial presence as his predecessor. The story in Warped was also an outlandish departure with the introduction of Entropy and his time twister machine. While the first two games felt grounded in their world's fiction, Warped grew into new territory that still worked but didn't feel as fitting as what came before it. Sure, Crash Bandicoot 2 took the action into space, but that kind of backdrop didn't feel out of place with an antagonist like Cortex. A case can be made for time travel matching up with Cortex's conduct, but between manning a space station or sitting in an ancient Greek Colosseum, it's hard to say one doesn't feel more appropriate than the other. In terms of motivations, the player was never left wanting. For the first game, simply plowing through the islands to reach Cortex's castle and rescue Tanya was enough to keep you on course, while the second and third entries brought in the concept of collecting crystals. Those purple shards provided clear, quantifiable units to measure progression now that the level selection screen wasn't a linear path, and gave characters something with weight to carry their conversations. As a trilogy, I've always liked how the story of each entry lined up. Crash defeating Cortex at the end of the first game leads to the villain uncovering a crystal in the second, and Crash leading Cortex's space station to fall back to Earth at the end of the second game unleashes Uka Uka and sets the events of the third game in motion. All three games in the original trilogy are fantastic and worth revisiting, but I feel like Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back, represents the franchise at its finest thanks to its diegetic narrative, reasonable difficulty curve, and strong focus on traditional platforming. Despite being a longtime fan of the series, though, I'm no authority on the subject. Those who feel the first game is best may be few and far between, but I'm sure there's plenty who feel like Warped is the pinnacle of the trilogy and have some solid points to back it up. So let's pass the question off to you. Which Crash Bandicoot game do you think is best? Vote using the card above or share your opinions in the comments below. I'm curious to see if my opinion matches the majority or just happens to be a little warped.